At the same time as the release of the big 40k points update this week, Games Workshop also confirmed when the next and bigger one will be. Let's talk about the impending balanced data slate in December, and perhaps the slightly surprising amount of hints that Games Workshop have given us as to what's coming. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the impending balanced data slate, and Games Workshop saying that there will specifically be changes for Space Marines, Genestealer Cult, Sisters and Deathwatch, and quite a lot more besides. Games Workshop had already given us a hint that the balanced data slate could be dropping in December a little while back. At their last big preview online, they showed off a rather awesome Deathwatch animation, and then in a follow-up article focusing on it, they decided to share some potentially good news with Deathwatch fans as well, saying that there'd be some sort of Deathwatch update coming in December specifically, with the aim being to represent bigger armies of Deathwatch once more. I talked about that in its own video, including the possibility that it could mean that the balanced data slate was coming early this time. It seems possible that it could be either way. It could have just been its standalone digital update, but Games Workshop tends not to do those quite so much if they can avoid it. Aside from things like the odd kill team datasheets, when they make major revisions to 40k factions, they tend to come alongside the main balance update, I think partly to just try and keep things contained, and maybe lessen the feel that there's updates happening literally all the time and people can't keep up as much. It seems though that Games Workshop have confirmed that that update is indeed going to be a balanced data slate. As with their big points updates that just dropped earlier this week, they were good enough to tell us that there will indeed be a balanced data slate coming later this year, and as mentioned give us a fair few fairly good hints as to what we can expect from it. Even without the Deathwatch hints that we had, that probably meant that it was odds on for December. It's certainly not going to be literally the next week or two since this one, and November again seems far too soon. Typically they tend to do balance updates in increments of 3 months, so trying to push it as close to that as possible, it'll be somewhere mid to late December. As well as talking about those specific faction hints, there's tended to be the usual things from them, the balanced data slate, new points in a Minotaur and Field manual, though I might guess there might not be quite as many points changes as this time around, given that that was the main focus of this update, and also the usual things like further FAQs and errata that may be needed, though I'd imagine that they've got quite a lot of that out of their system with this one, given that they did all the faction FAQs and things. December is definitely early for them though. Typically their balance pass happens every 3 months or so by their original intent. Their calendar usually has 2 major balance passes with a balanced data slate each year. Those are the ones where they might make some fundamental changes to factions and usually try and improve the lot of some armies that have some legitimate complaints. Say for example the nice detachments that Drukari got last January, or the big changes to some army rules and weapon profiles and things that Admech and Tyranids got in the June one. And then in the interim they just try and fix what they can with points changes, which maybe aren't quite as big to digest, and aim to just push things to a little bit more both internal and external balance between factions. Why this one's coming early, as usual, is a bit of a mystery. They don't usually tend to go too deep into why they release things on the exact dates that they do. I kind of wonder if it might be their intent going forward just to change their calendar slightly, so they have one in summer at June time and then one in December as opposed to January. That maybe feels a little bit neater within a yearly calendar maybe. Though I guess it's also possible they might want a longer gap after the data slates themselves. This is the second one in a row now where we've had a points change and then basically a balanced data slate coming out 2 months later. I don't know if that's going to be the new normal or if they're going back to a more 3-monthly thing after this. Another possibility is that they don't want the data slate dropping in January to try and avoid messing with the Las Vegas Open, one of the biggest and most prestigious 40k tournaments around. And they have been shown in the past that they do get in contact with those and try and not mess things up too much for them if they can avoid them for the really big events. And perhaps that means that December isn't the worst time for an update to come out. It means that people can digest that over the Christmas period where there don't tend to be many events happening. So perhaps dropping it off before the holiday period works out well for everyone. My guess is that it probably won't be between Christmas and New Year. Most people, including Games Workshop, tend to down tools a little bit then and just show off a whole bunch of models and teasers that they had scheduled to entertain people over the holidays. I guess it's not impossible, but my guess at the moment would be that I'd say mid-December seems most likely, maybe around about the 18th or 19th if they want to drop it on a Wednesday or Thursday again. That would be my first guess at least. At least that way there's 2 months after the previous balance update as opposed to this one. Either way though, it does feel like a very quick turnaround time. A common criticism of current 40k is that it updates too often. This one now seems to be the more common gripe that mentioned online versus the game being unbalanced, perhaps the one causing the decline of the other maybe. In one of my last channel polls, around about 60% of people thought that 40k updated too fast, with around about 40% people being happy or think it goes too slow. It's definitely not universal, but it still seems that slightly the majority of people would prefer them to ease off the pace a bit. And I feel like this announcement of the next balance update at the same time as they drop the current one probably isn't going to help people with that general sort of vibe. With only a gap of around about 2 months, it almost cheapens this update a little bit. It's only going to be a temporary state of affairs before things change in a big way once more. Enough time to get some games in, but maybe not too worth going majorly into collecting an entire army based on this rules if they could be in flux once more again very soon. My guess is that they've announced this one to basically tell people why they haven't really done anything to help out Core Codex Space Marines in this points update, specifically saying that there's going to be rules changes coming for them, so try not to lose your mind in the meantime, in a similar sort of way to what they did with the AdMech earlier in the year. I feel like with this faster turnaround though, they're not going to have a load of time for data gathering in terms of data gathering for this points update. I'm sure they'll get some trends and data after the first month, but things can change over time even if they don't make any further changes. I sort of wonder if they're kind of queuing up both the points update and the rules things thought about at the same time, so I've kind of only seen half of the update that was planned. Before we move on to talk through the specifics of what's coming in this update, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold, a US-based company that sells magnetic carry cases based in West Virginia. Magnetic carry cases have become an increasingly popular option for transporting models these days. The idea is that you mount magnets on the bottom of your bases and then attach them to either metal or magnetic sheets so they don't rattle around and bump on each other in transit, and you don't need to fiddle around with foam. While you can certainly make your own DIY ones, Tabletop Stronghold's mag cases are aimed to be a purpose-built solution, a case made of sturdy MDF and then steel trays that slide in at different levels, having a bunch of slots so you can adjust the height on them for different size minis. Compared with other magnetic cases on the market, the MDF does mean that they're a little bit heavier and they do require a bit of assembly first, but broadly reviews I've seen of them have been positive. The boxes are notably very, very sturdy, and the acrylic display sheet on the front means that you can see the miniatures being transported, which most other cases won't have that option, and it's quite nice to be able to see your models and the nice painting as you transport them around. Broadly speaking, reviews on Reddit and things have all seemed pretty positive from people who've got some. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll check back at the end of it to check through a few of their specific offerings. They ship worldwide free to the most of the world, and there's a code TACTICS for a big 20% off for the next few days. Getting back to the subject at hand though, as mentioned, Games Workshop have given us some really quite specific hints as to what's coming in this update. Now no less than 4 things that are going to be getting a major update of one sort or another. Codex Space Marines getting improvements, Miracle Dice being altered for the Sisters of Battle, Cult Ambush for Genestealer Cult getting changes, and Deathwatch getting some sort of major revisions to actually allow them to function as a full army again, as people might have collected over the last few years. It sounds like even with those 4 that would be a fairly major update, though I suspect there'd be a bunch of other things that they feel like will be a good idea along the way. At the summer one, they had really quite a lot of smaller revisions, changes to datasheets or keywords to make things work better with certain detachments, though I did find it interesting that this time around in the points update in theory, they actually decided to make a bunch of changes in errata that feel more like they'd be better placed in a balanced dataslate perhaps. Unlike most of the things in errata, these ones weren't really bug fixes, more just trying to make models play better. Vastor gaining access to 3 stratagems in his unique detachment, the Silent King working in obeisance phalanx, and tank commanders gaining the squadron keyword at the cost of a points increase. I feel like all of those were really quite nice feels-good changes for their respective factions, though perhaps does shine a light on the weirdness of how Games Workshop makes patches like this. It means that each army might have certain bits that change in a very similar way, both in the balanced dataslate and in the errata document of their codex, and there not always being any particular rhyme or reason as to why one changes in one place or in another. It does perhaps mean that things are a bit easier to miss if you're just trying to see all the updates for your army. Indeed, there was one that I missed with the Death Guard and Fetched objective markers getting a bit better as to when the rule can trigger and allow boosted stratagems and things, and that was one that I missed when going through the changes this time around. Delivery aside though, let's talk about what could be coming for those factions and start off with the Codex Space Marines. I feel like the Space Marine balance problem with how to not make core Codex Space Marines directly inferior to the Divergent chapters is a subject that I've talked about on the channel quite a few times now. It's basically been the exact same talking point every single time they update Space Marine points costs or do anything with them balance-wise, and it's not really something that you can fix with points in a satisfying way, given that basically the Divergent chapters will have access to all the standard Codex Space Marine things aside from some named characters, so the vast majority of changes that you do to buff Codex Space Marines will just help out the Divergent chapters just as much. With the point system as it stands, the only way that you could do things would either be to have incredibly undercosted core Codex characters to a kind of weird extent, and this still doesn't help out for, say, salamanders that don't want to run their special characters in one list, or make all the Divergent chapters units just very mediocre and no better than anything in Core Codex Space Marines, and if you do that, then they just won't play with their own unique units, and that'll feel really boring for them. The actual quote that they said was that they're going to be trying to make a better experience for Codex Space Marine players, so it finally sounds like change is going to be around the corner for this, and if they do it right, I feel like it could be genuinely quite fun for a whole bunch of collectors out there who felt like their chapters have been on the back foot for a really long time. There are lots of ways that they could make rules changes to make their chapters better. One suggestion that I quite like the idea of was to allow some sort of boosted version of the lore-friendly detachments from the core codex. Maybe Salamanders get a more savage Firestorm Assault Force somehow, and Ultramarines get a superior Gladius. I feel like that feels good and give you a further bonus for playing with the fluffy one. You could do some kind of split points cost, likely meaning that some of the Divergent chapters pay a bit more for the units that they get more out of, probably things like Blood Angels and pretty much any assault unit, and I feel like while this might be effective, it could also be pretty clunky and take a bit more admin and memory, and I feel like it wouldn't add the most excitement and interest as well. You could maybe buff Oath of Moment somehow. If you're not taking the advantage of using one of the major Divergent chapters, you could just add something in like a reroll 1s to wound, which will at least be something as a reason to play Core Codex. I don't think I'd go as far as putting back the full wound rerolls back on it though, as that was just kind of game warping against certain factions with big tough units, but just not very good against factions without them. Or you could go down some sort of other complicated route, like maybe add on some form of chapter tactic. Perhaps say Salamanders, regardless of detachment, always get +1 strength to their flame weapons or something. Or Imperial Fists get an extra pip of strength or AP or something on bolt weapons, possibly with or without needing one of their unique characters to unlock that. I feel like that's probably unlikely to happen though, given current 10th edition design and wanting all your rules locked into each detachment. Will be interesting to see if they go for one of those or something completely different, but I think it's genuinely nice to have the promise of something useful coming for the core codex not too long around in the future. Next up, for the Genestealer cult, apparently there's going to be some sort of tweak to Cult Ambush. The specific quote that they said is, "We're looking at Cult Ambush mechanics," and I must admit, for them it really feels like a rule that's got multiple different problems going off at the same time. Firstly, a big gripe has been the sheer randomness of it. The way it works is that you roll a dice, and on a 4+ you essentially get a unit back on the first couple of turns, and then onto a 5+ in the last 3. And given that you could be losing units of, say, anywhere up to 300 points, it just feels really arbitrary, where you roll a dice and on a 4+ you get that 300 points again, or on a 1-3 you don't get any of it. 40k is a dice game, and it's not awful to have a little bit of randomness, but I'd say that this is probably going a bit too far in terms of good game design. It feels a bit dumb that basically the win or loss of a game could really be decided by a few 4+ rolls going one player's way or the other. Say a Genestealer cult player plays perfectly, but because they failed their first 3 Cult Ambush rolls, they're probably not going to win anyway, or vice versa if they play rubbish, but it just happens to be one of the games where they're getting all their units back, so can just coast the foe on a never-ending tide of mutants. I feel like a better way would be some sort of system to smooth out the mechanic somehow. Perhaps say auto-passing one if you fail your first 2 or something, or some kind of progressive modifier. There's a few ways that they could go about it, but just trying to make a system where in a few games you don't just basically either auto-lose or auto-win because of those rolls would be good. The second issue with it is the deployment of the units, usually via blip token or cult ambush marker. When they released the codex for Genestealer cults, it just made this mechanic kind of terrible, given that you can't easily return units to reserve, so what would often happen is that if your units did come back, they'd have to deploy the marker so far back that they'd be out of the game for a good few turns, maybe not even make it to be meaningful until, say, the very last turn once more. They basically made the fun core faction mechanic so little used that they decided to do an emergency patch for it, giving you another option to arrive your units after they'd gone into Cult Ambush, essentially turning up near enough by normal deep strike but by another name. That definitely added a whole bunch of strength and was a good reason for Genestealer Cult getting a fair bit stronger again. But it's kind of sad that the blip token bit is now almost a bit irrelevant. It's now sort of a position locked rapid ingress, which definitely does have its uses, but most of the time might be a lot less reliable than just putting down your forces again this turn and maybe having a go at a charge or doing some more shooting. Particularly as you don't know if your opponent's just going to wipe out those Cult Ambush type markers, so there might not be much point in saving your units to try and use one of them. It's also maybe not so great from the codex mechanics as well, as a fair few of the detachments have various different tricks to manipulate the Cult Ambush markers, and they're not going to be super relevant if they're just sidelined and not really the main focus of the mechanic anymore. And overall I'm just not really too sure what the fix is here. but I think it would be nice to have the blip tokens be a far more meaningful thing when the units do return to the board, but also not have it that if you're using them, it's basically a massive disadvantage. Based on the latest points updates, I feel like they're not really going to need things changing from a pure strength perspective. They look like they were moving up to kind of mid-tier in terms of win rates after the Cold Ambush change, and then got a fairly massive points buff from the update. They're still going to struggle to take down the toughest things in the enemy army, but they do have some powerful shenanigans and now a whole bunch of numbers on their side as well. I wouldn't be too surprised if they're one of the stronger armies in the game for a bit. Next up, and one of the more unexpected announcements, was that they're going to be changing Sisters of Battle Miracle Dice in some way. The words they used are that we're looking at Miracle Dice usage and generation, and this one felt a bit more surprising to me. While they're certainly a powerful mechanic, and they are a big focus of the Sisters Codex, I don't really think that many people were seeing them as a problem that really needed to be fixed as such. They hadn't changed crazily enormously since 9th edition 40k. I think they have quite a nice feel to them, with the Emperor intervening with just a few key roles, meaning that Sisters units can sometimes punch up to do something truly unlikely, whether it's a Castigator bouncing a high AP shot off its invulnerable save, making an improbably long charge, or plugging an auto 6 into a melter damage result to bring down something that a standard melter gun usually wouldn't be able to. I think overall the feeling of them is quite good. Again, like the Cold Ambush, I wonder if they might be trying to do something to limit the variation of them a little bit. Like the Genestealer cult, it feels like just a few big rolls could really push the faction one way or the other. Say if you just roll nothing but 1s on your miracle dice early on, or if you roll a clutch of 6s, again that's going to be an absolutely massive swing in the game as to what you can do with them. I'd be apprehensive about them nerfing them too much, particularly given that Sisters units really seem to be costed for the use of the mechanic now after their big increases, but perhaps they could do something to reduce variation again, maybe a system of say combining bad dice to make higher scores like they had in the past, or something similar to that kind of effect. I don't know if they might think about looking at the Triumph again as well, whose main role was to spit out some Auto 6 Miracle Dice in basically every Sisters competitive list. Now it got bumped up to 250 points. It's either a ridiculous chunk of your army or going to get left behind. I feel like maybe the automatic 6 thing might be a little bit on the game warping side. I wonder if they might think about making the automatic dice thing not quite as impactful, which I'm not sure will be looked at as the best thing in the world by Sisters players, but on the other hand, it might mean that the model's cost doesn't have to be quite so astronomical because of the stuff that you can do with those 6s. I'm genuinely a bit unsure as to what they might be going for with this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Otherwise, we had the Deathwatch teaser. For this one, they gave us really quite a lot of hints when they were trying to fend off people being annoyed at them for the state of their army when they were showing off cool Deathwatch animations. They said lots and lots of people have gotten in touch with them over the last few weeks with thoughts on how Deathwatch kill teams work in 40k. A couple of squads in an army isn't enough for most players, and you want to mobilise the full might of a Watch Fortress, which I'd kind of interpret as we still want to use the armies that we've built and collected for Deathwatch over the past few years. While such deployments are rare in the 41st millennium, they're not unknown, and the Ordo Xenos and the Warhammer Studio is not deaf to the many calls for aid. We can confirm that in December we'll be releasing a digital update with more options to take your Deathwatch army to the field and lay low the alien menace, so watch this space. They also had a small announcement as a response to someone commenting on that article, saying good news that the studio is working on digital updates that will once again see Deathwatch armies take to the battlefields in games of Warhammer 40,000, and it's expected in December. Between those two, it sounds like Deathwatch are going to be reappearing as essentially a full-fledged faction, and quite possibly in a format not so very different from their digital index that they had before. Currently they have their problem where either you can only take a small smattering of the Deathwatch unit and then sort of ally them into Space Marines and have the two forces just not really interact with each other as they don't share the right keywords, and also not use the wider Deathwatch rules for the Space Marine force. They'd have to use one of the core Codex detachments. The other alternative is to use their unique Ordo Xenos detachment in Codex Imperial Agents, but if you do that you can't use any Primaris Deathwatch units that you might well have collected over the years. And with 4 data sheets, that army really can't stand on its own 2 feet anyway. Between those two, exactly how they do it, I'm not sure, but my guess is there'll be a return to being able to use the Space Marine units plus Deathwatch data sheets all together, and allow them to use their Black Spear or Ordo Xenos detachment type rules, and have them all fighting together once again. Even just a return to the status quo of not having to either ditch the Primaris or have no Deathwatch detachment rules I think will be welcomed enough, and allow the Deathwatch units to integrate with the Space Marines using their transports and marine keywords once again, get over the moment back, and have attached character to their squads. I guess the dream might be that they return a few of the Primaris kill teams from Legends for a bunch of people. Not that you can't play them, but it does kind of imply they're not going to support them too well once they're there. though I'm a bit skeptical as to whether they'd go about doing that. In general, if they don't sell boxes of one unit, they don't tend to support it, so mixed Primaris Deathwatch units might have to wait until they actually bother to make a box for them. Overall, I'm really not too sure what to make of this one. It could be kind of super low effort and literally just reverting things back to where the Deathwatch were before, but fewer units in their roster. Hopefully they managed to add some sort of fun factor beyond that. I feel like their special issue ammunition just wasn't particularly well implemented. Being tied to bolt weapons plus 3 stratagems kind of limited the detachment overall, and they were fairly rarely used. I feel like some sort of redesign of that might not be the worst idea. If Deathwatch are getting that kind of focus within Codex Imperial Agents, I'd hope that the wider Imperial Agents book would also get some love. They're kind of borderline unplayable in Warhammer 40k at the moment, just not really balanced versus the other factions in any way. Perhaps a bit more limited to smaller points games and maybe a bit more emphasis on fun and fluff than outright power. GW gave them absolutely no points adjustments in this recent balance update, and I'd guess that might well be just because there was no good way to fix them with points. If they did so, they'd just make them very cheap in a sort of horde-style army, with everything being far cheaper than you'd expect it to be. It does seem that they'd have easy ways to buff the faction if they wanted to. Getting an actual faction rule could be a start, and that's kind of a no-brainer space that they could add power to the overall army given that they lack one, and otherwise maybe trying to turn one or more of their units into something that can really properly deal with tough tanks and vehicles would be nice, as opposed to having to rely on allied knights. I'm really not too sure how they could implement that though. They have very little in the way of big heavy guns. Maybe getting a faction rule that's unusually good against heavy hitters might not be the worst move. Otherwise, for hopes for the Dataslate, I feel like there's a few things that could really use some focal help. Another thing that was maybe unusually passed over were the Orc buggies and the Cult of Speed this time around. Basically all of the Orctober buggies are kind of bad in game, and again they do feel like the sort of thing where a rules fix is far better than a points fix for them, as otherwise they just get incredibly cheap and feeling inappropriately so for how big the models are and what they look like on the board. I think if I had to choose between the two, I'd probably prefer them to actually buff the datasheets of the individual buggies and just make them a bunch more dangerous, rather than buff Cult of Speed so they're just even more skewed to only being good in that detachment and terrible everywhere else. And otherwise for the Orcs, I'd quite like them to take a look at their big hunt at some point. It's not completely unusable at the moment, though its rules just work far better against certain armies that rely on big monsters and vehicles, and you're kind of playing without a faction rule if you don't have a suitable unit to mark as their target each turn. Having to just go on a big hunt for something like a Scout Sentinel or a Genestealer Cult Ridge Runner isn't the most satisfying. Otherwise, the Dark Angels attachments seem like another one that's really ripe for upgrades again. All of their Codex ones have basically been unplayed in competitive versus the Gladius, or at least unplayed with any significant success. All three of them could probably use some help in different ways to try and have them on a bit more level playing field with the core Codex detachments. I think the same could be said of a few of the other Codexes, the Tyrannus detachments as well maybe. Maybe adding the Harvester keywords to a few more units could be nice for the Assimilation Swarm. And despite a couple of improvements, I still feel like Crusher Stampede isn't really where it needs to be in terms of actually adding too much strength. Loads of other things that they might do though, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more besides. Let me know what your hopes will be for the upcoming December balance data slate down in the comments. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned earlier, one option for some custom built magnetic carry cases made of sturdy MDF. Here's a closer look at those magnetic steel trays that they have on each level. Quite a good capacity on each one, around about 90 odd inventory bases or 30 odd terminators. You might not want to load each layer quite this full, but it does give a fairly good example of what can be fit on if you want to. Magnets can often be fairly efficient in terms of miniature per volume if you don't need to worry about foam and things. For the different size box offerings, the mini version is this one, £84, $100 or €101. As mentioned, there's that tactics code for 20% off until the 23rd of October. That's part of their initial launch sales things for going worldwide. They come with a bunch of magnets that you can stick to the bases of your miniatures and vehicles and things. 70 odd magnets here that you'd mount to the bottom of the models with some green stuff or super glue. Here's the more standard size army mag case. This one £140 or $165 at base. That one's including free shipping to a whole bunch of places around the world. And this one could fit a respectable size army in it. It's tall enough for quite a few miniatures. Say for example you can see the Chaos Knight on the bottom layer here. So it's big enough for some tall stuff and then a couple of ranks of shorter miniatures besides. Then here's the really big one in the Mag Case XL, basically two of the previous ones attached together. This one's a little bit more than double due to getting more steel trays with this version. There is an option for fewer steel trays as well if you wanted to save a bit there and you don't think you'd need as many layers. I'll leave the internal dimensions down there, and in this one you can see the clear display piece clipped together at the front. Again, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out the link in the video description if you'd be tempted to pick one of these up. They do feel like one good option for transporting miniatures, although bear in mind there's plenty of other options out there. Foam cases might be right for some, and you can absolutely custom build your own magnetic cases as well. So I think there's definitely a market for something a bit more purpose built like this. In any case though, if you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the prize giveaways, so feel free to check that out if any of that's of interest. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.